I think that's something that feels really unprecedented now. As a part of the work we've been doing over the past few months, we've had the opportunity to work in coalition with a lot of different women from different conflict zones, Ukraine, Myanmar, Afghanistan, and they all really clearly see, Hamas is ISIS, is Boko Haram. Like these forces of evil are all coming for everyone basically. And it's hard that the people who are affected by this sort of violence really see and understand it. And there's this really clearly orchestrated denial campaign against people who are experiencing this type of violence when it happens in Israel.
Hi, and welcome to the Z3 Project podcast. I'm Amitai and Fraiman. I'm the director of the Z3 Project, and this is our podcast. On today's episode, I had a very heavy and meaningful conversation with my friend Laura Adkins, who is the Senior Director of Strategic Communications at Jewish Women International. And previous to this role, she was an opinion editor at The Forward. And Laura has a long history as a journalist and activist. She's very much vocal on a variety of topics. And in her current role, she is dealing, unfortunately, with a lot of the sexual violence that happened on and after October 7th. And in our conversation, we covered, we learned and heard about her professional kind of trajectory and what she's seeing in media and in her multiple visits in Israel and describing the mood of the country and the people. And we focused also and learned and heard a lot about the different versions or the motivations behind the denial of these atrocities that happened during and after October 7th to men, women, and children. And the real importance it is for us to, as a community, to know about this and for the world to hear and stand shoulder and shoulder with the victims. And despite, I noted this at the end of our conversation, despite this being a heavy topic and in a very heavy kind of moment, I left the conversation quite hopeful in the way that Laura described her work and in her encouragement and for us and others to look for community and support, and knowing that there's a very big difference between what we're seeing online and on the ground in terms of what people feel and believe about what's going on. And I hope that you too can find some inspiration for hope in this episode. So this is the Z3 Project podcast with Laura Adkins of JWI. I hope you enjoy this episode. Please follow us on our various platforms and social media, sign up to our newsletter, stay in touch, and have a great rest of your day. Laura, welcome to the Z3 podcast. It's great to have you here in this
Thank
conversation.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Yeah. I know it's been a while since we tried to kind of schedule this. You've been quite busy
yeah,
the past several months. And I'm really happy that we're having this conversation, have this opportunity to hear from you and your perspectives, your insight to a lot of what's going on. You have multiple vantage points that I think are incredibly interesting and important for audiences to hear. So I'm really excited that we are able to do this, and just welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. Yeah. Excited to be talking with you as always.
This is great. So I think, we typically do in our work in Z3, as you know, you've been here as a speaker several times. We try to have these meaningful conversations about a variety of topics. Typically, it happens to be or ends up being across the aisle, so to speak. And this podcast is really about helping drill down a little bit more and with some of our past speakers and otherwise, and give them an opportunity to do a little bit of a deeper dive. So it's it can go into several layers more than what we typically have in our conference. That's kind of the context of this episode. And as we get started, I think it would be really helpful for our listeners to learn a little bit more about you and how you ended up in this hot seat here in this conversation. Just for context and background, I think it could be helpful.
Sure. Where to even begin? So we can start with October, I guess, and then work from there. So on October 7th, I was the opinion editor of The Forward, where I had worked for several years, have been a journalist both in Israel and the US for about a decade. and booked the first flight that I could to Israel. I knew that this was an existential moment for the future of the state, for our people. And as a journalist, the impulse is usually to run toward the danger rather than away from it. And I knew that I had to be there on the ground. And I knew that I not only had to be on the ground, but I needed to use the connections and knowledge of the place that I've been lucky enough to gain over the years to really tell stories that were off the beaten path and that weren't going to be told by the foreign journalists who, by no fault of their own, don't really know the country and were, flying in to cover the war like any other war. So I originally thought I was going to go for like a week. Because we had scheduled all of these 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War events.
Right.
Because before October 7th, it's, the similarities are really uncanny and wild. And I'd been really focusing on Israel being caught unprepared, and being attacked and having all of its conceptions about the way things are shattered in that war. And then to rush to Israel, and the way that I describe how the mood was in October there is very much like if anyone's ever been in a car crash where the airbag goes off and there's dust everywhere and your ears are ringing, like that was very much the vibe in Israel in October. And so I spent the rest of the month. I came back because of Z3, actually. I could have stayed much longer, but I spent the next month in Israel, reporting really broadly on how different communities and individuals were experiencing October 7th and what happened next. So I, I still am a journalist and still it's a very important part of my identity. But in February, I had the opportunity to work more directly on a specific element of what happened on October 7th that is very significant to me, which is the sexual violence committed against men, women, and children by Hamas on and after October 7th. So I joined the team at Jewish Women International and in February, and since then I've been covering what's happening in Israel as a freelance journalist while also working more directly on how to support Israeli women and girls, but also on how to combat violence against women and girls in the U.S. and globally. So that's kind of broad strokes.
Yeah. So busy is really
Always.
Always busy, always busy. Yeah. I mean that there's a lot there to kind of follow, and I can't. I haven't been back in Israel since. We're gonna go in the summer,
Yep.
but if you can, you describe this feeling of almost like a post-car crash,
Yeah.
of airbags and dust and ringing in your ears. And, no one knows what to expect, walking into a war zone. And yes, we've
Yeah.
all, we've grown up unfortunately in a period where there've been several smaller wars and many military
Yeah.
campaigns, I guess. And I'm curious to hear from your perspective, first as a journalist, what was different? What was like starkly different
Yeah.
this time for you?
Yeah. It's a really important question. So my first journalism job was at the Times of Israel in 2014. And I started like 3 days before Operation Protective Edge started. And I think what I learned there, twofold. One about the country, and two about how what's happening in Israel and the Palestinian territories is not understood by people who aren't there. And so I was still in college at NYU and was covering with the amazing team of the Times of Israel and David Horowitz. I was covering really closely what was happening and, going to see how, I mean, it was incomprehensible how many hostages were taken on October 7th, and 3 hostages were taken, later found to have been killed. And just the energy of the country, how everyone of every background and sector really was united around, like, we need to get these boys, find them, or find out what happened to them. And Meanwhile, the rhetoric back in the United States was this very one-dimensional, at least on my campus, it was very one-dimensional. Israel's the oppressor. This is, justified. Israel going into Gaza is a war crime in and of itself. Obviously, not everyone. I think it's important to emphasize that still, by and large, most Americans and particularly most elected representatives in the United States are very pro-Israel. But we were seeing what we're now seeing much more of, the seeds of this really deliberate twisting of what is happening to make any violence against Israelis justified, and really a refusal to acknowledge any Jewish or Israeli pain and dismiss it as you're the oppressor, doesn't matter, this is simple, this is not complicated. So going from that experience, I took a lot both of my understanding of the country and also just understanding that it's not well understood for a variety of reasons outside of the Middle East. And so I think something that a lot of people are experiencing right now, my age, is kind of this feeling of abandonment by progressives or by people that they thought they sat in community with. And I think there's a real, at least in my communities here, like this real kind of soul-searching moment of where to find community and identity. But in Israel, October, there I was also just blown away by how quickly the country mobilized and just supported each other in the same way that every time something like this, I mean, this is unprecedented, but like the people that were leading the apparatus of the protest movement overnight were basically running the country, whether it was sending chairs to people who needed Shiva chairs, finding hostages. I went to visit some of the affected kibbutzim on the periphery, and like literally the protest movement people were in their t-shirts, like sending people to farm in particular places. Like it was just incredible to see how much of the energy of the country just very quickly united. And I just got back from a very quick trip last week, and I think things have kind of changed in a few ways. Everyone is still very united in the understanding that Hamas needs to be defeated in order for Israel to feel secure. But I think there's a growing, I mean, I think there's a growing despair really is at the root of this, that it's been over 200 days since the hostages were taken. There hasn't really been movement on getting the last of them home. And there's, when I was just there, I spent a lot of time speaking with survivors of the sexual violence that occurred or of the Nova Festival, and they all told us, there's so much denial and there's so much refusal to believe what happened to us happened. And I think that's something that feels really unprecedented now. As a part of the work we've been doing over the past few months, we've had the opportunity to work in coalition with a lot of different women from different conflict zones, Ukraine, Myanmar, Afghanistan, and they all really clearly see, Hamas is ISIS, is Boko Haram. Like these forces of evil are all coming for, everyone basically. And it's hard that the people who are affected by this sort of violence really see and understand it. And there's this really clearly orchestrated denial campaign against people who are experiencing this type of violence when it happens in Israel. And I just, I've covered a lot of complicated stuff, and I've covered like far-right extremists, Holocaust deniers, and certainly like crazies in every category. But the level of just really rabid denialism that I've seen about this violence is just so unprecedented.
So yeah, you're describing, you brought up several points here, and I think they're worth kind of isolating, I guess. One is you're saying, in terms of like an arc, where you started in 2014, there was unfortunately another hostage taking situation, smaller scale, of course. And then you noted how it was different in this time around, of course, in scope and scale, but also named a familiarity around the mobilization of the country. I mean, in 2014, arguably, it wasn't as necessary, and also there wasn't a proceeding. It wasn't as necessary in that the levels of failure weren't so staggering. So it didn't feel like we needed citizenship to kind of like step up. And also the fact that the October 7th happened after a year of what seemed to be, and still is there, like great division internally around other topics. And it was noteworthy to say that there is a sense of this coming together. And I find that interesting. And you mentioned how in this last trip you started noticing a sense of despair. And that's I want to follow up on that. But the other point I think is something that we probably end up spending a lot of the time of this, because that's something that I think is it's incredibly painful and unfortunately doesn't get enough, I think, is this whole side of sexual violence and the denial around it when it comes to what happened on October 7th. But before we go down that rabbit hole, I do want to go back to the observation of Israeli society, and because I think that's it's for someone who lives here, and most of our audiences listen in North America, they read the news, they follow, but it's hard to capture a mood of a people through all of this information. So if you can maybe like give that illustration of a car crash is very powerful, but if there's
I mean, now that the dust is kind of settled, so to speak, I think there's a deep pain at, I think most Israelis, and I'm struggling also, like are struggling to understand. On the one hand, there's sort of an attitude of, we'll do what we have to do, even if that means standing alone. But I think there's also, there were literally cupcakes with Biden's face on it in the early days of the war when he was, unequivocally supporting anything Israel chose to do. And I think the longer the war goes on, the more destruction and devastation there is, and the more Israelis see the world turning against them. And that is very difficult for a people to understand or to feel like they're under existential threat while also seeing the world say, actually, you are the oppressor here. And I think there's a real feeling of isolation on top of the feeling of despair. I think there's also Netanyahu has not gotten more popular as the war has gone on, and I think there is a real divide between, like, most of the victims of October 7th were the people most dedicated to peace. They were people who, one of the women in the video of the hostages being taken from the military base was a volunteer in a Palestinian-Israeli dialogue program. A lot of the people killed in the kibbutzim, were intimately involved in efforts to bridge divides. And a lot of the speakers, or a lot of the individuals I spoke to on this most recent trip who lived in these kibbutzim and kind of were having to fight back terrorists in real time, were saying, like, they just kept saying these people, they knew which house had a dog. They knew, like, where the armory was in the kibbutz. It was clear that people that knew us and that we trusted and were trying to, like, break all of the stereotypes that our people harbor about each other. Like, these were the people that ended up enabling this massacre to occur. And I think there's a sense of betrayal from the government. There's a sense of betrayal from the Gazan people in general, even though, of course, not all of them are responsible. There's a isolation, betrayal, despair. And I think there's also, it's hard when there's no movement on things. And watching, we're recording this when there was an attack in Rafah that took out 2 terrorist commanders. Also, civilians were killed. It's not clear yet exactly what happened. But there was a massive outcry in the West, and a lot of Israelis that I've spoken to and I've seen are frustrated that they are condemning the civilian deaths. They're saying, any death is a tragedy. And they're also saying, where were you for the last 8 months or on October 7th when we were the victims? Like, where were you? You were not saying all eyes on the kibbutzim, like you're saying all eyes on Rafah when these attacks happen. So I think there's, trauma is not a concept that Israel is well versed in handling in the best of times. I do think that now there's been a really, really deliberate and successful push by the psychological community within Israel to really support survivors and their families and hostage families, in a way that I haven't seen in previous rounds of this conflict. So I think there are all these like really toxic and destructive and embittering emotional things going on, but there really is a circling the wagons in a really healthy way of a psychologist I spoke to has organized like a WhatsApp group, and she said anytime any survivor of the violence, they have someone that needs a therapist, like within 3 seconds, like someone volunteers to speak with these people. So the hostage families and the survivors, there is definitely, I think, more effort and intention around supporting them. But there's circles of trauma. Like it's not just the hostage families that were affected by the hostages being taken. I spent Pesach in Camp Ramah Darom outside of Atlanta, where Hirsch Poling Goldberg and his family spent Pesachim a lot of years. And there were like 400 people there that really view Hirsch as a member of their community, even though they're not in Israel. And just these rippling circles of trauma, I think it's gonna be really difficult and take a really long time to understand just how deeply that impacted everyone. But there's a Nova survivor that I look to her as a source of hope. Her name is Tali Binner, Binner, and her Instagram is like a perfect encapsulation of holding two things at once. She survived the Nova Music Festival with 7 friends hiding. She testified in Sheryl Sandberg's documentary and in other places about witnessing rapes and sexual violence occurring. And she has been such an outspoken advocate, but at the same time, she's posting, you know, public stories of her at a music dancing things with friends, or like trying a cold plunge pool, and it'll oscillate between, hostage rallies and calling for support and sharing survivor stories and like just the texture of daily life. And I think that holding two things at once is kind of the Jewish experience in a lot of ways, but I think particularly now, that does give me some hope.
That's good to hear. That's yeah, that's certainly that sense of needing to hold several complicated emotions at the same time is something that we're gonna have to figure out over time. I do want to hear about. I want to follow up on this. You said that Israelis are feeling more and more abandoned, and
Yeah.
I want to. It's not the same, of course, but I think it could be useful to, because you mentioned this earlier, how you yourself are dealing with this sense of, or people in our, in age cohort, are the sense of abandonment, from communities or people that they thought they were friends with, allies, whatever. Do you think that the way you described it, it sounded almost like Americans or Jews outside of Israel experienced that abandonment earlier than Israelis in a
Mm.
way? Um,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
because for if you're not in an Orthodox community for the most part, or you're not living in a very intentional Jewish community in the United States, most of your friends and day-to-day people aren't Jewish. And in Israel, even though it feels like the whole world is not supporting you, your neighbors do. And,
Right.
you know, there's community in a real sense. And I think here I mean, we already like are dealing with all of the isolation of COVID and this shift to totally remote working for a lot of people that we have not reckoned with at all, I think. So you pile on like just the more general isolation here that people face with the experience of like I'm pretty insulated from this. I work for a Jewish organization. Am in intentional community. And for a lot of people, like I'm very involved with Israel Policy Forum and we have a book club. And before October 7th, maybe like 6 people, 7 people would come, which I like. It was very intimate. And the first book club after October 7th, we had like 30 people. And they didn't really want to talk about the book. They wanted to talk about, what is happening? Like, why do I feel all these things? Like I'm being forced to think about being Jewish. And, I we're not experiencing like a pre-Holocaust moment in the West. I really do not think we are. But I do think that in the same way that a lot of German Jews felt like their secularism and success insulated them from anti-Semitism in the early 1900s, I think a lot of American Jews very successfully assimilated and felt like, we're good progressives. We, are there we marched with Black Lives Matter. We, stood with Me Too and believed all women. And now that something happened to our community, there's like a deafening silence. And I think a lot of people are just really feeling that their intimate community abandoned them. And in Israel, it's there again, there is a sense of that as we described, but by and large, like it's in Israel, you have like the texture of the people around you is with you. And I think in the States there's also, of course, like a lot of survivor guilt. And in Israel, that's very acute for a lot of people. Um, and I think here also there's a cognitive dissonance of like, do I even like have a right to this suffering or these feelings of being targeted for being Jewish when I don't live in that state and I, am insulated. So I think there's a lot of complex emotions that everyone is
Are
struggling
you?
to make sense of.
Yeah, certainly. I know yeah, for sure, every day. Do you see any signs of like a lasting shift in how the Jewish community outside of Israel relates to itself, to Israel, to the world?
Mm. I don't know. I think it's really too early to tell. I do see some things that are making me optimistic and some things that are scaring me a bit. Um, I think that the wrong response, I will just call it out. I think that I have seen a lot of, for example, if the Ivy League colleges are going to allow protest encampments to happen, we shouldn't send Jews to Ivy League schools. We should, only send to Brandeis or Yeshiva University or schools that, we should have made clear that they don't like us. We should go somewhere else. And I don't think like abandoning the project of Diaspora is the right answer. And I do think it's important to like lean into the number of allies that we do have, even within the progressive movement, Richie Torres, for example, in New York. So I think for some people, there's this like real pull toward like isolationism as a
Hmm.
group, and a hardening of beliefs. But what I am seeing that makes me positive is makes me optimistic rather is there's a lot of people who didn't really think about their Jewish identity before October 7th who now are like involved in Jewish community. And those aren't reflected if you look at like synagogue memberships or things like that. But as I
Right.
mentioned, Israel Policy Forum, we have like a young professionals chapter, and I was talking to one um guy around my age, and he was like, I grew up in Queens. Like, I was Jewish, but it didn't really mean anything. And like, I didn't date Jewish women. I didn't like go to synagogue. Like, it was just kind of like, yeah, sure, I'm Jewish and they're Italian. And now he's like leading events at Israel Policy Forum
Yeah.
and like really leaning into like trying to understand things. So I do think that there's this. I think for a long time, what worried me here was that there was not really a future for non-Orthodox Jewish communal life for young people. And I really see that that has changed post October 7th.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And I wonder, I want to go to like the questions about, your work and the sexual violence. But you keep on bringing, it's your fault. No, you're bringing up stuff that it's like, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I want to hear more about that because I think, I think for a long time, for better or for worse, the, Jewish identity, I'm not saying anything that certainly you don't know, but, I think this is pretty common at this point, in the discourse is that in American Jewish life, support of or building or identity formation around a relationship to Israel became the centerpiece.
Yeah.
And while that worked at certain areas, we know that in our age cohort, that has seemed to this was the prevailing narrative. I don't, it seemed to fail in a way. So to a
Yeah.
point where people are like, well, if I don't have a Jewish life and I don't support Israel, then really culturally affiliated, but not much more. And what I hear you describing is that around this tremendously traumatic event, people are returning to a sense of Jewishness, but once again, it's around a connection to Israel. And I'm
Yeah.
naming it. I don't have like a
Yeah.
follow-up thought. It's just like, is this going to be like, how do we do it differently? Is it just recognizing that it is? I don't know.
Yeah. I was discussing at length with a friend today, our frustrations with it's not healthy to have an identity that is framed around being oppositional to something, right? Like since the protest movement started in Israel last year, I just keep asking, who is the person that we're going to unite around and elevate and like bring an idea into fruition? Like you can't, as we've seen in this country, like your principle cannot be I'm anti X. That like that's not healthy. And I think that for a long
It's not
time
it's not
here,
healthy internally, and it also emboldens the subject of the
yeah,
anti. It doesn't
right,
work. Right. Sorry. Yes.
right. And I think when we talked about, you know, Jewish identity being framed around Israel, it is often in a defensive posture. It's not, let's make sure that American Jews speak Hebrew so they can speak with Israelis, understand the texture of the place, have
Mm,
experiences there that are cultural and visceral and lived. It's like, let's make sure our kids are prepared to fight back on college campuses. Like,
right.
let's make sure that like we're, Hasbara, right? Explanation. That's not like a healthy, I think, like identity, right?
Yeah.
But what I'm seeing now, even though it is around Israel, is it's also around community. And I
Mm,
think, I mean, for me personally, I never felt as strongly the importance of having both a strong Jewish state and a strong diaspora as I did after October 7th. While I was in Israel, I was constantly checking on my friends here because the anti-Jewish protests were so
right.
worrying to me on October 7th and 8th. And I don't think we're in a place where a healthy Israel exists without a healthy diaspora. And I don't think a healthy diaspora exists without a healthy Israel. And I think that when we focus on connection and community between those two places, but also in those two places, that is the start of identity formation that's not in opposition to
Yeah.
something. But I think where a lot of uh, the failures have again been trying to prepare people to like wage this
Right.
battle, and it's like no, like it's Judaism. If your Judaism is not like this deeply textured thing, it's going to very easily fall by the wayside. So you can either give people a rigid version of Judaism with very strict rules and boundaries and very high penalties for leaving, and that's one way to keep people in. And the other way to keep people in is give them like a positive thing to be uniting around, community and connection and history and culture and language and people. And that is something I think is really important in this next chapter of like post October 7th global Judaism.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was like a perfect encapsulation of everything that we want to do at Z3. So I could end here and be like, and that's it. Thank you for the strong endorsement.
Yes.
But I mean, yeah, jokes, or being silly, putting that aside for a second. I certainly, I mean, lean into that, right? Into that sense of, it's not, the expectation of defending Israel was assuming that there was a very solid relationship and sense of, an understanding of what you're defending, and then it's just, then how do I activate that deeply rooted thing instead of saying no, it's a relationship that you have to cultivate and nurture over time.
Yeah.
That's the focus of it. Whether or not someone decides to,
Yeah.
To put themselves out there in a way is secondary. That can't be the way in which you express your Jewish identity. It has much more of an internal community-facing thing. So it really resonates with me. And like I'm encouraged, and it gives me, and I'm feeling optimistic around this. This is what you're seeing in your different experiences. I do want to turn, and I want to give time to to hear more about your work at JWI in this sense of and not in the I'm very interested and curious to hear about like your observations about the side of denial, right? And what's going on there? What can we do? What should we be doing? Because that's a piece that's baffling to me. Like I just don't, it doesn't compute at all in any way.
Yeah.
I can't make sense out of it. And I just want to hear thoughts on that.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that happened that contributed. So first of all, in any conflict, documenting this sort of violence is very hard. In general, even in non-war situations, we know that sexual violence is one of the most underreported crimes and under-prosecuted crimes. And in wartime, it's 85,000 times more difficult. So in Israel, the first responder system that exists it has a certain set of guidelines and it has a certain set of goals, right? The goal of emergency response for terror attacks in Israel, which is primarily done by the police and by Zaka, which is an all-volunteer organization of Haredi first responders. The priorities are collecting all the physical remains in line with Judaism's deeply held belief that all physical remains of a body are sacred and must be collected to the extent possible. The objective is speedy identification
and bring to burial. Like that's the
correct.
I'm elaborating for those who are not familiar.
Yes.
I know the shorthand is helpful, but also
apologies for the shorthand. And the second highest priority, I mean, these are all at the same level of priority, is quickly identifying bodies so that families can be notified. And those two operating principles, that's how Zaka and first responders in Israel to terror attacks operate. They were not treating these attack sites as crime scenes in the sense of culling forensic evidence, or, they didn't think that these sorts of crimes were necessarily happening, and they didn't have the training to identify these types of crimes. So the first level, just in all of the chaos, I mean, I was at these kibbutzim a week after October 7th, and Zaka was still sorting through remains. We also know from IDF investigations now that a lot of the attackers use an accelerant that increased the temperature of flames, so it was even more difficult to perform these tasks. And Zaka first responders, they're mostly not trained medical professionals or forensic anything. I think Israel has 9 forensic pathologists in the entire country. Um, and this process, the second step of the process is there's a base called Shura Medical Base, military base. It's a base that was fully designed for the identification and preparation for burial of soldiers killed in combat. So something that I did not know before was normally in Judaism, there's a ritual, I guess you would translate tahara as like purification process for a body before burial that involves someone of the same gender washing the body, preparing it in a shroud and placing it in a pine coffin. So someone who dies in a terror attack or in service of the IDF, um, they are considered like pure as is. So they are not cleaned for burial. So there's medical professionals at this base that were identifying bodies and documenting. And there were also volunteers who prepared the bodies for burial. And it was at this stage in the process that folks started to notice a pattern of a particular type of violence. But again, they were focused on getting these bodies buried as quickly as possible for the families and identification.
Yeah, all this is, I mean, just for the added dimension, all this is informed by Jewish law, right? The speed in which we,
Yeah.
we bury,
Yeah.
the burial process in Israel are way quicker than outside of Israel.
Yeah,
The process of
but
identification,
even not like there's the base also has an imam. They have a Druze clergy member, I suppose is the term. So any soldier or victim of a terror attack has the religious, like they can have a
yeah.
burial
Oh,
according to their tradition.
yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of intentionality and thoughtfulness
Right.
around
The,
all of this.
right. The point I just wanted to for our listeners to understand is that that with all the steps that you're describing, there's an underlying accelerated the attempt is always to as quickly as possible,
Yeah.
which makes
Yeah.
it right. Like
Yeah.
that's just what I wanted to. Yes, certainly there's
Right.
all religions, etc. I'm just saying okay, yeah,
Right.
sorry.
So once this pattern started to emerge, and again, it's important to keep in mind, like first week of October in Israel was chaos. Like this was a time, well, sorry, second week, I suppose. This was a time when families of hostages had not yet heard from the government. This was a time when families of kids from the Nova Music Festival were performing like quasi police interrogations of kids that had escaped to get any details about their children. Like this was a time of unprecedented chaos. And while all of this is happening, people at the base are starting to notice signs of sexual violence on bodies. And it was at this time that the first public statements from these first responders and professionals started coming out that they had seen signs of this type of violence. But of course, it's incredibly difficult to collect evidence in the best of times on this stuff. And as we mentioned, that was not really the priority here. And it was not seen as that sort of crime scene. So even standard things like taking photographs of bodies and things like that, there were several Zaka first responders who did this. And several of them I've spoken to have been like, people need to see these photos and really understand what happened here. But these are not trained medical professionals, and sometimes in the immediate fog of what is happening, things look differently than they necessarily were. So what happened in very early days, you had first responders who had been working around the clock, not sleeping, doing nothing for days, but basically pull bodies out of the ash. And several of them gave interviews to the media about what they'd seen. And a few of the stories ended up not being accurate in the end. And bad actors seized on this fact to discredit anything else, even once there had been further investigation. So if you fast forward to November and December, there was a really serious process of trying to interview as many survivors of violence as possible and witnesses to what happened, particularly at the Nova Music Festival and on the road Highway 232, where a lot of people were escaping. There were a lot of living witnesses. Unfortunately, most of the victims were killed. Um, but very soon, this very well documented series of testimonies and pieces of evidence started to emerge of the systemic nature of this violence. And the Association of Rape Crisis Centers in Israel put out a report detailing a lot of the early evidence. And a lot of news organizations soon followed suit. The New York Times had a big investigation, I believe, in December that detailed a lot of this violence. And the problem is that it takes a long time to gather the documentation and speak to witnesses and all of these things. And in those several months, the deniers of these atrocities had had time to really double down on this never happened. The IDF is using this as an excuse to, go into Gaza. These women are not victims. They're lying. They're plants. And there was just this vicious cycle. Jewish Women International is focused on gender-based violence in general, and I am not an expert in like the trauma-informed side of this, but what I've learned from my colleagues is that survivors usually don't ever come forward, and if they do, it takes an extraordinarily long time usually for them to get to a place where they can tell about what happened to them. And there was an incredible woman, Amit Susana, who miraculously she survived Hamas captivity and sexual violence in Hamas captivity, and she told her story to the New York Times. And immediately there was just, it didn't happen. The head of Hamas said, good Muslims would never do this. This is haram. They would never commit this type of violence.
Yeah, they would kidnap and murder, but they wouldn't. Even they have.
Right. And there was everything from, you're too ugly. This would never happen to you. You're making this up. This doesn't justify killing Gazan. There was just like, and I've met Amit. She's an incredibly strong woman. And if you read the UN special envoy, Pramila Patten, came to Israel and spoke with these first responders, and her team put together a report saying that they have reasonable grounds to believe that this violence happened and it was systematic. And the Secretary General of the UN acknowledged that this violence happened. And the New York Times independently investigated, The Guardian, all of these big outlets. But for some people, it will never be enough. And it's really frustrating, and I hate whataboutism. Like I detest it, and I think it's lazy intellectually. And a lot of the people who are denying this sort of sexual violence occurred would never question other victims of this type of violence. And the level of proof that is demanded of Israel is beyond what any other survivors experience. And there's this really twisted way of viewing Israelis as almost not human, like just these oppressive, monolithic group of white people who are oppressing the brown Palestinians, and anything they say is just an excuse, and any sort of violence against them is justified because they're in occupying power. And that sort of rhetoric is extremely dehumanizing, and it leads people to be able to say this awful stuff that has been said. And then, certain people go even farther, attempting to discredit the reporters at the New York Times, and the New York Times stands by their investigation. And it's gotten to the point that, this whole rhetoric is so insidious that I had a friend of mine reach out who has become very anti-Israel. And, I was trying to send her information about this, and I sent a New York Times article and a CNN article, and she was like, New York Times and CNN are like way too pro-Israel. I'm not reading anything from them. So there's just like this, and of course our side thinks the exact same thing, that they're too anti-Israel. But yeah, it's just this incredibly toxic climate combined with just the absolute chaos in the immediate aftermath of what happened. Combined with, Pramila Patten, the UN Special Envoy, in her report, she noted that this online climate of denying survivors contributed to more survivors not speaking with the UN team and not coming forward. So it's this self-reinforcing cycle. I mean, anyone who looks at what happened to Amit Susana, not only what she suffered in captivity, but what happened after she came forward, I don't know why anyone would come forward. It's not worth it. And yeah.
It's such a, it's depressing, it's sickening, it's really, it's hard to comprehend even. Like I admire, your ability and others' ability to not only hear and witness the stories themselves, which is an incredibly important act within itself, but also virtually day in and day out deal with those insidious and those I don't know what to call them
Yeah.
voices who continue to deny it. And I picked up on something I think that you said in the beginning when we started, and also later, that it feels very orchestrated.
Yeah.
Some of these responses and stuff, and I maybe say more what you mean by orchestrated.
So I wrote an article, the months blur together, but wrote an article within the last 8 months, let's say, of I was noticing a very high volume of actually I remember what it was. The New York Times did a survey of American voters,
Hmm.
and they had a finding that kind of stood out to me, which was that holding all other factors, across ages and races and genders, increased TikTok usage correlated with anti-Israel sentiment. It's like, that's weird. So at the time, TikTok, you had the ability, they gave a list of trending topics which excluded political ones, but you could search using their search tool to see the volume of particular topics. And I searched for, Palestine, Free Palestine, Israel, and the pro-Palestinian content, at least that which was tagged that way, it knocked me off my feet. Like, it was the overwhelming majority of, like, the next topic trending didn't even come close to the number of pro-Palestinian videos, and really anti-Israel videos. And so I called a friend of mine who runs a think tank that looks into this stuff. And I said, Joel, have you been noticing anything weird going on with TikTok? It's like, funny you should mention, we're having a report come out tomorrow. And what his organization found, the Network Contagion Research Institute, was that the volume of anti-Israel posts on TikTok is about 9 times as much as the pro-Israel content. But beyond that, the Wall Street Journal did an experiment where they created accounts as 14-year-olds on TikTok. And the way TikTok works is it basically, the algorithm gets to know you very quickly and it serves you content it thinks that you will enjoy. And what these reporters found is that within the first, I think, like 100 swipes, the majority of the accounts they created as 14-year-old users were served anti-Israel videos. So this is not just that there are people posting anti-Israel content, it's that TikTok's algorithm, which we know is heavily influenced by the desires of the Chinese government, and the New York Times has reported extensively on this. There's a reason that even before the forced sale of TikTok, government employees were not allowed to have it on their phones. The US government considers TikTok an espionage tool of the Chinese government. And I know all of this sounds like a wacky conspiracy theory, but it's not even about Israel. It's about intents to sow discord and division within the United States. And this is a very divisive issue, and bad actors are using it to sow division. So that's one part of it. And then there's a lot of energy around discrediting Israel. There's been, I don't want to make too much of it, but there's been a massive amount of Qatari investment in our universities, in major cities, in trying to kind of buy influence and make impressions on young American minds. And we don't fully understand the extent to which there's a coordinated campaign versus how much there's just like this hostile climate of, I guess, naturally occurring anti-Semitism. But there is really clear indication that it's not just people woke up one day and decided to hate Israel.
Right. So how do we not want to turn inward and circle the wagons? If everywhere we
Yeah,
look, either
yeah,
organic, it's interesting to note that, like, in the Eurovision, right, that whole thing, when Eden Golan performed, it was noticeable how when the judges allotted points, Israel came in very, very low. And then when it was the public opinion, Israel scored, I think, the
yeah.
second highest
Yep,
um,
yep.
in terms of popular opinion. And like, so what's going on? What can we, like, what should we do? Can we do, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, in general, my philosophy is I try to focus on what I want to see more of, not what I want to see less of, because I really do feel like where we focus our energy and attention is important and our most valuable resource. And of course, like I and others are doing a lot of work to hold the perpetrators accountable for what happened and to really share the stories of survivors, which they have asked us to do. Um, but again, I keep coming back to like we cannot form a healthy identity as just one in opposition. And how do we not slip into that? I mean, I got a lot of hope. I mentioned the meeting when I spoke to a House caucus on women, peace, and security with women from all of these different countries who have experienced unspeakable tragedy, who really did get it. Like again, there's especially when you look at social media, it can sometimes feel like we're really alone and isolated, but it's not quite all the case. And I think leaning into when I was on this most recent trip, JWI partnered with Seed the Dream Foundation to bring a bunch of female, just amazing women, sex crimes prosecutors, journalists, to Israel to meet with survivors and things like that. And there were several women on the trip who were not Jewish, and this was their first time in Israel. And these are like progressive women who are very strong in their own religious beliefs. And to see what is happening kind of as reflected in their eyes made me very hopeful because they were just so like, of course this is how it is. Like, of course we stand with you as, women who care about other women and as people who care about the truth. And I think if we spend all of our energy on like, if I asked, an AI model to look at Google search results for Israel and tell me what Israel is, I imagine like if we look at our community conversations, the model would say Israel is not an apartheid state. Israel is not committing genocide, rather than like Israel as this like really interesting textured place. So again, instead of like just focusing on the denial, I think leaning into like there's this community of women who believe each other and are supporting each other. There's a lot of people in the United States who do see the truth of what is happening. There's a lot of Jews who have a lot of energy to be in community with one another now that maybe didn't on October 6th. And again, of course, we have to fight the external battles, but you can't do that and neglect the internal and expect everything to be fine. So I really just think the more that we can kind of turn inward, not in like a self-defensive way, but turn inward in a, what do we as individual Jews and as families and as communities need in this moment to like really recenter and regroup. I think that is so important. And if you just are trying to fight these battles, you're going to be very bitter and you're going to see the world as, just this oppositional place. So yeah, I am not very good at doing it myself, but we're all figuring it out.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I mean, we're all exposed, but it sounds like you're over, in that, I don't know if overs, you can decide that or not. But I mean, in terms of the amount or the intensity of the information, the visuals, the testimonies that you are exposed to, it sounds daunting. Like I can't begin imagining
Yeah.
dealing with that. So I do hope that you are able to find and live by that and find a way to kind of, decompress and take care of yourself. Because it's incredibly painful and difficult and totally
Yeah.
important and
Yeah.
really is. So I mean, we're coming near the end of our conversation. And sometimes I ask, if there's like a parting thought or something that we didn't cover and that you would like to share, but more on point, trying to, share with our audience something that we couldn't reach in this conversation.
Yeah. I think that we are an incredibly resilient people, and for whatever reason, everyone can ascribe it to a different thing. We are still here despite, numerous attempts to make that not the case over thousands of years. And I think that can give us the courage to stand a little bit taller and not, focus on just fighting and really spend a little bit of time maybe leaning into, again, building the sort of community we want to see. Um, I also just really encourage people, you know, I I've been back a couple of times now since October, and every time I'm there, even like the most cynical, grisly, hardened Israelis that I speak to say, "Thank you for coming here." Like as the first thing they tell me. I'm like, "What? Why are you telling me thank you?" Like this is first of all, it's my job. Like second of all, of course. But again, Israel feels extremely isolated and disconnected and like they're fighting a battle by themselves. And if one has the ability and the resources to do so, also connecting with Israelis that live within your diaspora communities, it really does mean more than you might think to go to Israel or to, speak to Israelis, hear about what they are experiencing. And I mean, yeah, even me who's very cynical and was kind of like, okay, like great, like these groups are going and picking strawberries, like what does it really matter? But it actually does really matter because the people you're doing it for see you and they see you wanting to spend your time and energy in community with them. And I also think just, like taking a breath before responding to things has never led me astray in my life, and every time I don't do that,
Yeah.
I regret it. So I would encourage especially those who are fighting the good fights online to like really just take a breath and consider, whether it's worth your time and energy every time you engage.
Yeah.
And I should
Thank
also
you.
say
Yeah.
final thing if I
No,
can.
please.
Um, So, as I mentioned, Jewish Women International and Seed the Dream Foundation are doing a lot of work
Yeah.
on the gender-based violence and building a global community to support Israeli women. And if you go to IBelieveIsraeliWomen.org, you can follow all of that work and get involved
Wait,
yourself.
there was a sound glitch there, and I want to make sure that we got
Oh
the
no.
domain. Yeah, right. It was like right the last thing. I want to make
Yes,
sure we get that.
IBelieveIsraeliWomen.org,
Okay.
or on Instagram, I Believe Israeli Women. Find us. It's also on jwi.org. You can find it, but there is a global community who is growing around making sure that these atrocities are not forgotten and the perpetrators are held accountable.
Right. So, Laura, thank you so much. I have to admit that coming into this, as excited as I was to finally catch up and hear all the wonderful stuff you're doing, there was a level of trepidation around the heaviness. And I have to admit that I'm leaving Actually, yes, very heavy topic and very painful, but also with a lot of sense of hope. And I'm grateful that you're, able to point us in the direction of, things to keep in mind. And if it's about finding community and focusing on building positive versions and expressions of Jewish identity. And I like the way you said about, how you focus on what you want to see more of instead of focusing on what you want to see less of. And I think that's really instructive and helpful. So thank you for that. Thank you for coming on for this conversation. And I look forward to our next collaboration or project. And
yeah, definitely.
All right.
Thanks.